There was a printout sitting on my kitchen table a few years back. Blood pressure, 128/68. My doctor had looked at it during my annual and said those numbers looked pretty good. At least, that was what I thought too. But there was a third number on that printout. I had not been looking for it because nobody had ever told me to. It was the difference between those two numbers, 128 minus 68. That gap was 60 points. And once I understood what a gap of 60 points meant, I went back and looked at every blood pressure reading I had taken over the past 3 years. Every single one. My name is Wayne Ellison. I am 68 years old, I am not a doctor, and none of this is medical advice. Before you change anything about how you manage your health, especially if you take blood pressure medication, please talk to your own physician. That conversation comes first. What I do here is read the studies, the clinic handouts, and the guidelines so I can walk into my own appointments with better questions. That is the frame for everything I share. Today I want to walk you through something that took me too long to find on my own. There is one number on your blood pressure printout that tells you something your systolic and your diastolic cannot tell you separately. I will show you what it is, how to calculate it right now from any reading you already have, what the American Heart Association and major cardiology institutions say it means, some of the food and lifestyle patterns the research associates with better arterial health, and the specific questions to bring to your next appointment. Every source I name is real. Everything I cover is checkable. How does a number that sits on every single blood pressure printout go completely unmentioned in a 10-minute doctor visit? I think the answer is simple. There is no time. There is no money in teaching you to read your own numbers. The appointment ends before the explanation starts. But you can learn this yourself, and once you do, you will look at every blood pressure reading differently. Number 1. What pulse pressure is and why nobody has been asking you to calculate it. Every blood pressure reading gives you two numbers. The top number, your systolic pressure, measures the force your heart generates when it pumps and pushes blood out into your arteries. The bottom number, your diastolic pressure, measures the pressure that remains in your arteries between heartbeats when your heart is at rest and refilling. Those two numbers are both important, but the number nobody asks you to calculate is the gap between them. That gap has a name. It is called pulse pressure. The calculation is as simple as it gets. Subtract the diastolic from the systolic. If your blood pressure is 120/80, your pulse pressure is 40. If it is 130/85, your pulse pressure is 45. If it is 155/70, your pulse pressure is 85. The American Heart Association and major cardiology research institutions recognize pulse pressure as a cardiovascular risk marker, particularly relevant for adults over 60. Based on the cardiovascular literature, a pulse pressure of around 40 millimeters of mercury is generally in the healthy range. A pulse pressure above 60 millimeters of mercury is considered wide, and that is where the Cleveland Clinic and Mayo Clinic describe it as something worth discussing directly with your physician. I want you to go find a blood pressure reading right now. A home cuff log, a pharmacy printout, your patient portal. Subtract the bottom number from the top and write down what you get. We are going to come back to what the trend in that number actually means. And here is the part I did not know until I started digging. That gap between your numbers is printed right there on every single reading. It has always been there. I just never knew to calculate it. Number 2. What a wide gap actually means inside your artery walls. This is the part I wish someone had explained to me before I was 60. The mechanism is straightforward once you hear it. When you are younger, your arteries are elastic. The walls are designed to stretch and then recoil. When your heart pumps and sends a surge of blood outward, elastic artery walls expand to absorb some of that force. Between heartbeats, they spring back. That recoil is what keeps blood flowing forward and keeps your diastolic pressure from dropping too far between beats. Artery walls change as we age. The elastic fibers in those walls, a structural protein called elastin, gradually break down over decades. The body replaces elastin with collagen over time. Collagen is stiffer and does not bend and return the same way elastin does. Researchers refer to this gradual change as arterial stiffness, and it is documented in NIH-funded longitudinal research, including data from the Framingham Heart Study, one of the most comprehensive cardiovascular studies in American research history. When artery walls stiffen, something predictable happens to both of your blood pressure numbers. The systolic, the top number, tends to climb. Stiff walls cannot cushion that pump surge the way elastic walls can, so the pressure wave from each heartbeat travels harder and farther than it should. The diastolic, the bottom number, tends to flatten or drop. Stiff walls cannot sustain that between beat pressure the way elastic ones do. The result is a widening gap between the two numbers, and that widening gap is exactly what pulse pressure is measuring. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. Two people can both walk in with elevated blood pressure and have very different arterial situations. A person with 138/90 has a pulse pressure of 48. A person with 155/72 has a pulse pressure of 83. Both might leave the office with a conversation about getting the top number down, but the second person has a very different arterial profile, and the research reviewed by the Cleveland Clinic associates that wider gap with a higher cardiovascular risk pattern in adults over 60. I mean, think about that for a second. The same conversation about systolic pressure can be happening in two completely different bodies, and without calculating that gap, nobody knows which one you are in. That changed how I read every blood pressure measurement I had ever taken. But that was not even the beginning of what I found when I started following this thread. Number 3. How to read your own trend, because one number misses the point. So let us get practical. You have a reading in front of you. Subtract the bottom from the top. Based on the cardiovascular literature, a pulse pressure of 40 or below is generally in the healthy range. A pulse pressure between 41 and 60 is worth watching and worth tracking over time, even though a single reading in that range is not necessarily cause for alarm. A pulse pressure above 60 is the range where the Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, and American Heart Association guidelines say the conversation with your physician is warranted. When I laid out my own readings over 18 months, I found something I was not expecting. My individual readings had all looked reasonable in the moment. My doctor had commented that things were in a reasonable range. But when I put the trend on paper, my pulse pressure had been moving upward, from 46 to 55 to 60 over roughly a year and a half. No single visit showed a dramatic jump. The drift was slow and steady, exactly the kind a snapshot never catches. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. One reading is a snapshot. Blood pressure fluctuates throughout the day based on activity, stress, caffeine, the time of day, even the position you were sitting in when the reading was taken. A trend across 6 to 12 months is far more informative than any individual number. The simplest change I made was starting a log, a notepad sitting next to my home blood pressure cuff. Each time I take a reading, I write down the date, the systolic, the diastolic, and then I add the pulse pressure calculation by hand, 10 seconds. After 3 months, you have a trend line instead of a collection of disconnected moments. The American Heart Association, as of 2026, recognizes home blood pressure monitoring as a valuable tool for building a more complete picture of your actual pressure across the day. If you do not have a home cuff, asking your doctor whether one makes sense for your situation is a reasonable first question to bring to your next visit. Most people never heard about this part. They get the two numbers, they hear whether those numbers look acceptable, and they stop there. The calculation that connects the two numbers is what falls through the gap in a 10-minute visit. Nobody has time to explain it. So many of us have been walking out of those offices for 20 years without ever calculating the number hiding right between the two we already knew. Number 4. What the research associates with supporting arterial health? I want to be clear from the start here. There is no food that makes your arteries young again. That is not a claim anybody with real data is making, and you should be skeptical of anyone who says otherwise. But there is substantial research from real institutions with real funding about what dietary patterns are associated with better vascular health in adults over 60. The American Heart Association has studied this for decades, and the findings are consistent enough to be worth knowing. The first area is potassium. The DASH eating plan, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, is the dietary pattern both the American Heart Association and the National Institutes of Health point to for blood pressure management. One of the central mechanisms behind DASH is potassium intake. Potassium helps your kidneys process and excrete sodium more efficiently, which reduces the volume of fluid your blood vessels have to carry at any given time. Less volume means less mechanical pressure on your artery walls. You do not need an exotic supplement to get this. The highest potassium foods I started rotating into my own meals are not complicated. White beans, lentils, sweet potatoes, spinach, avocado, bananas. The goal is a consistent pattern shift across the week. That is how the DASH research is designed to work. The second piece is omega-3 fatty acids. The American Heart Association recommends 2 servings of fatty fish per week as part of a heart-healthy diet, citing omega-3s and their consistent association with reduced cardiovascular risk. The mechanism involves reducing chronic inflammation in artery walls and supporting what researchers call vascular tone, the capacity of blood vessel walls to relax and constrict appropriately. Salmon, sardines, and mackerel are the ones I keep in my own rotation. Ground flaxseed and walnuts provide a plant-based form of omega-3, though the body converts the plant-derived version less efficiently than the fish-derived form. The third piece surprised me when I first read about it. It involves dietary nitrates. Certain vegetables, specifically leafy greens like spinach, arugula, and Swiss chard, along with beets, are high in compounds the body converts into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a signaling molecule that tells blood vessel walls to relax. It is part of why the DASH diet shows the results it does across the research, and it is documented in NIH-published work on vascular function going back many years. This is a food-first mechanism, and it is real. I mean, think about that for a second. Eating more spinach and beets has a measurable effect on how blood vessel walls behave. The research on this is solid and consistent. Fourth is sodium. You have heard this one. But the reason the mechanism is worth naming is that understanding the why tends to make the behavior stick. Excess sodium causes the body to retain water. More water in the bloodstream means higher blood volume. Higher blood volume means the heart has to push harder against more resistance with every single beat. The CDC recommends no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day for most adults. Americans typically get well above that, primarily from packaged and restaurant food, before ever picking up the salt shaker. So, yeah, that adds up fast. Talk to your doctor before making major dietary changes, especially if you are managing kidney conditions or taking medication that affects fluid balance. The research supports these dietary patterns directionally. They are associated changes. Outcomes vary by person, and your doctor can help you interpret what they mean for your specific situation. And somehow, it gets more interesting when I get to the last piece of this conversation, because the most overlooked item here is a test. Number 5. The test worth asking your doctor about by name. Your blood pressure reading at the doctor's office is one data point from one moment. You drove there, sat in a waiting room, had a cuff put on your arm in a clinical setting. Research reviewed by the American Heart Association documents what is called white coat hypertension, where blood pressure reads meaningfully higher in a clinical setting than during the rest of a person's day. The opposite pattern also exists, and it has a name: masked hypertension, where the office reading looks acceptable, but pressure runs elevated for much of the day when no one is measuring it. A tool that addresses both of those patterns is called ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. The American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology recognized ambulatory monitoring in their major hypertension guidelines, updated in 2017 and reaffirmed since as the most accurate method for diagnosing hypertension correctly. An office reading captures one moment. Ambulatory monitoring captures a full day and night in the actual conditions of your life. What it involves is wearing a blood pressure cuff continuously for 24 hours. The device takes readings automatically at set intervals through the day and overnight while you sleep. Your doctor receives data showing your average daytime blood pressure, your average nighttime blood pressure, and whether your pressure dips appropriately during sleep. That nighttime dip turns out to be clinically significant. The cardiology literature associates the absence of a normal nighttime dip, a pattern researchers call non-dipping, with elevated cardiovascular risk. And that risk shows up independent of what the daytime readings show. And no, I am not making that up. The research on non-dipping is well established and worth knowing about. This decision seemed small when I first brought it up with my own doctor. It was not. When I explained that my pulse pressure trend had been moving upward over the previous year and asked whether ambulatory monitoring made sense, my doctor agreed it was a reasonable next step. The results from the 24-hour monitoring showed my daytime average was acceptable, but my overnight blood pressure was not dipping the way it should. That single finding changed how my doctor approached my next 6 months of care, specifically the timing of one of my existing medications. She made that call. I brought the data and asked the question. Ambulatory monitoring is appropriate for some patients, and the decision depends on your clinical picture. Your doctor is the one who can tell you whether it fits your situation. It is covered by most insurance plans when there is clinical justification for it, and it gives your physician a far more complete picture than any office visit can provide. The slow widening of my own pulse pressure trend was a warning sign sitting on my printouts for 18 months before I knew to look for it. Once I did, the conversation with my doctor became a different one. The question to write down before your next appointment is this: can you look at my pulse pressure trend across my recent readings? And given what you see, would ambulatory blood pressure monitoring be appropriate for me? 2 questions, real terms. Your doctor can answer them. If what I am covering here is useful to you, please subscribe. I put out a video every week on this kind of material, the numbers and tests your doctor does not always have time to explain in a 10-minute visit, laid out plainly so you can walk into your next appointment with better questions. Hit subscribe and you will not miss the next one. By the time I had all of this information in front of me, my whole approach to blood pressure had shifted. I finally understood what the numbers were actually measuring, and I knew what to ask. Let me bring it back to where we started. A printout on my kitchen table, a gap of 60 points between 2 numbers. A doctor who said things looked pretty good and was not wrong, but had no time to explain the one calculation sitting right between the 2 numbers I already knew. Here is what we covered. Pulse pressure is systolic minus diastolic. Based on the cardiovascular literature, a pulse pressure of around 40 millimeters of mercury is generally in the healthy range. Above 60 is where the American Heart Association, the Cleveland Clinic, and the Mayo Clinic say it warrants a direct conversation with your physician. A wide pulse pressure reflects arterial stiffness. As we age, artery walls lose their elastic quality. The top number tends to rise, the bottom tends to hold flat or drop, and the gap between them widens. The Framingham Heart Study and NIH-funded research have documented this process across decades of data. You can calculate your own pulse pressure right now from any reading you have, and tracking the trend over 6 to 12 months gives you something far more useful than any single snapshot. The dietary patterns the American Heart Association and NIH research associate with better vascular health are not complicated or expensive. High potassium foods, fatty fish twice a week, leafy greens and beets for their nitric oxide connection, and keeping sodium under the CDC guideline of 2,300 milligrams per day. And there is a test worth knowing about by name: ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. A 24-hour picture of your blood pressure, including overnight, gives your doctor information that a standard office visit simply cannot provide. This situation is not unique to me. There are millions of people in their 60s and 70s who have been handed their blood pressure numbers year after year and told, roughly, that things look okay. The gap between what the numbers say and what they actually mean is where so many people are left to figure things out on their own. That is what this channel is for. None of this cost me a fortune. None of it is a miracle. It is what happens when you sit down and read the science they never quite have time to explain in 10 minutes. Write down the 2 questions. Bring them to your own doctor before you change anything, especially if you are on medication. If this helped, please subscribe and tell me in the comments what number you are working on right now. I read every single one, and I plan the next video around what I hear. Take care out there. I will see you in the next one.